Coming in, so I'm going to start to talk with people once they can get in. Hello, friends. So we went ahead and we're starting, and then I'll do our introduction, Professor. But I'm welcoming all of our friends. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on Stamp Chat today. We're going to just wait a couple 15, 20 seconds to let you guys all float in. Thank you so much for joining us. It's nice to be back behind the mic after a virtual stamp show. And friends, just so you know, this will be recorded, so there's our disclaimer. And we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm hitting record. No, oh, it's already recording. Okay. Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Stamp Chat. My name is Heidi Rhodes. Thanks so much for joining us. Our guest today joins us from Great Britain. An anthropologist and Methodist minister, James H. Grayson, served with the Methodist Church in Korea from 1971 to 1987, and then was appointed as a lecturer. Our U.S. equivalent is assistant professor in Korean studies at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He retired in 2009 as professor of modern Korean studies. His philatelic interests are in stamps and the postal history of East Asia generally, and in Korea particularly, and in the first issues of A Country. Professor Grayson is interested in the semiotics of stamp design. That is, stamps are government documents and someone has made a decision to issue a particular stamp with a particular design. Why and what is or are the meanings of the stamp and of this design? That's semiotics. He's a member of the Korea Stamp Society, the Sheffield Philatelic Society, which happened to be founded in 1894, and the First Issues Collectors Club, of which I know several members are on the call today. Stamp Chat is brought to you by Stamp Store. Sell online without all the hassle. Stampstore.org. Do you have items to sell, but you don't have the time or equipment needed to handle the scanning, the uploading, and the order fulfillment? Well, don't worry, Stamp Store is a full-service online store. We do most of the work for you, and no computer equipment is required. You complete a submission sheet for each item and mail them on to APS. We take it from there, so visit stamps.org to learn how to submit your pieces. And now for our presentation, North and South Korea, the first issues after the Second World War. Professor Grayson of the Sheffield Philatelic Society, take it away.
Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you all are. It's very nice to be on this Stamp Chat program. Heidi has given a very thorough and complete introduction, so I won't say anything more about myself other than that the number of types of stamp societies that I belong to, a local one in Sheffield, the area of interest of mine in the Koreas and East Asia, and the angular approach to looking at stamps or certain types of stamps with first collectors. And this gives us some idea of the sort of breadth of interest that stamp collectors, philatelists have. It's a very rich hobby. And tonight I want to share with you one aspect of the kind of study that I do. It comes out of, obviously, the interest that I have from living in South Korea for a very long time. And I'd like to introduce you and discuss with you about the first issues issued in the Koreas after the end of the Second World War through to 10 years later to the end of the Korean War. This is a very interesting and complex period, and I want to approach it from looking at what we'll call semiotics, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment. But here we have, just for your interest, the South Korean flag on our left and the North Korean flag on our right. Now, if this will go down, Oh dear. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Excellent. There. Now, just to put in the picture where we're talking about, obviously we're referring to the Korean Peninsula here with the two countries of North and South Korea, and Korea joins the East Asian mainland, not at China proper, but in the northeast here in Manchuria, and lies between there and Japan. So it's a very central, pivotal area in Northeast Asia, and that has a lot to do with the geopolitics that have enveloped Korea over the centuries. But that's the geographical location. I think it's useful, before we begin to talk about the first issues after the Second World War, to just have a quick look at the recent history of Korea. First of all, up to the very beginning of the 20th century, Korea was known under the name of the Kingdom of Chosun, a very ancient dynasty founded in 1392, and it was annexed. The kingdom was annexed by Japan in 1910. Following the Russo-Japanese War of 1945, Japan established a protectorate over the Korean Peninsula and the Korean Kingdom and fully annexed the country in 1910. And so Korea was under Japanese rule from 1910 to 1945. The interesting thing in terms of issuance of stamps, and particularly for first issues collector, is that South Korea, the Koreas have had, in a sense, 3 points at which they had first issues. There was a sort of false start in the 1880s, another start in 1890, in the 1890s when the postal system finally went into effect. But then that was eliminated, of course, with the Japanese annexation of the peninsula, and Korean stamps were not reissued again until 1945. The Japanese surrender, which we commemorated just a few days ago, was on the 15th of August, 1945. And following the pattern that was typical in Europe with Germany and Austria, the country was divided according to the occupying powers of the Allied forces. So the Americans were given the territory south of the 38th parallel to receive the Japanese surrender, and the Soviet Union took the surrender north of that parallel. And this, in effect, created, as in Europe, American and Soviet zones of occupation. And this condition existed from 1945 to 1948. So this is the first period that we'll look at. After 1948, we have the establishment of two new Korean states. One, the Republic of Korea, which we know popularly as South Korea, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which we know popularly as North Korea. And finally, concluding this period, the big event that happens, of course, is the Korean War, a 3-year war, which broke out on the 25th of June, 1950, and was concluded with an armistice, which was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. So this gives you a very brief overview of the 20th century history of the Korean Peninsula. And the particular period that we're interested in is this latter period, the period from roughly 1945 to 1953. Just to give you some idea of the close-up of the Korean Peninsula, here we have the 38th parallel, and you can see that territory that was now considered part of North Korea is now in South Korea, and parts of what North Korea are now in South Korea. So this territory is now North Korean territory. This territory is now South Korean territory because it follows the armistice line here. But this was the original division of the peninsula. Now, what we're going to, oh dear, we seem to have a little problem. I don't know, I'll move this down here in case, so that it gets out of our way. The approach that I'm taking to looking at stamps and stamp design is semiotics. That is, looking at how symbols and images convey meaning. And there are a number of scholars that have been working on this. David Scott is a famous British scholar. Jack Davies, who worked in the States, unfortunately now deceased. And there are others like Stanley Brune in the University of Kentucky and others. Now, if we look at semiotics, there are three kinds of signs or types of symbols that we can look at. First of all, there is the thing we can call the index. That is, it tells you what the stamp is. The first thing, of course, the stamp should tell you that it is a stamp rather than something else. It should also give some indication of the country that it is from, and it should also indicate that it has a specific kind of purpose. And generally speaking, the indexing factor is usually a text of some kind. Then there is the aspect of design that is called the icon, and this basically means the image that is on a stamp. It's pictorial, obviously, and it can represent some aspect of the nation's history, its culture, economy, some sort of theme that the government is promoting, and it may even be something which isn't even directly connected with the country at all. I mean, there are lots of countries that produce images on stamps that have no cultural, political connection. For example, any number of different countries will produce things on the British royal family. But anyway, that is an icon. It's the actual image on the stamp. Finally, the symbol. And this is an image which can become representative of a country. It is, well, for example, on British stamps, from the beginning, the stamps had the image of the monarch, beginning with Queen Victoria. And this, in a sense, also is not only an image, there's the on the stamp, it also becomes a symbol. It tells you the country that issued that stamp. And this is important in a sense because British stamps don't have the name of the country on it. Now, semiotics are interesting, I think, when we look at stamp design, because so often, I'm sure all of us have had this kind of experience. If you say that you're a stamp collector or a philatelist, people will say, oh, what's that funny thing? And why are you interested in those scraps of paper? Well, those little bits of paper, we remember, are government documents. They were issued by a particular country. It required resources to do so. The image and design of the stamp had to be approved by someone. It had to serve a certain purpose. So they are, in fact, a very underused research resource, not only just for the hobbyist who wants to know more about a country, but actually also as an academic resource. And this is the sort of thing that people such as currently Stanley Brune and others are working on. They're pointing out how these kinds of stamps tell us something, are good academic sources of information. So that's some of the things that we're going to be looking at tonight. And I'm going to start, first of all, with this image, and I'll move my picture up again to get it out of the way. This is the first stamp that was issued in Southern Korea, and I've used the word deliberately Southern Korea, under the United States Army military government in Korea period, which is that period 1945 to 1948. And it is an overprint of a standard Japanese definitive, which itself was issued in 1944. And this was issued on the 1st of February, 1946. Now, this image on the Japanese stamp is very interesting because this is the Yasukuni Shrine. This is the shrine in which deceased warriors, soldiers, sailors in the Second World War would be enshrined. And it's also a point of great soreness between Japan and the various other East Asian nations. But just to point out a few things about this stamp. Here we have the name of the country, basically Imperial Japanese postage, and in between these two sets of Chinese characters, we have a symbol of the state, which is the imperial crest. And here we can say that the text of this stamp is bilingual, because you have here the value of the stamp given in an Arabic number, and the same value here given in Chinese characters read from right to left, as is this title. Now, if we look at this stamp, this is a reused stamp, if you will, which has been overprinted by the military government from existing stock. They have printed this in, it says Chosun. This is not only the Korean name for Korea at that time, but it is also using the Korean alphabet. So this is a kind of nationalist statement. Now, of course, this was issued by the US government, military government at the time, but obvious, and this had to be approved by them, but the design was clearly made by Koreans. They have used the Korean alphabet, not Chinese characters as we see here. They've used the Korean alphabet. And so this says Korean or Korea stamp 30 jun, or which is a hundredth of a one. So that's sort of nationalist statement, and it's because it is making a very clear statement about Korean nationality. It's not just telling us the name of the country, but it's doing it in a Korean script, not Chinese script, because these two syllables stand for two Chinese characters, and this is the pronunciation of them in Korean. So this is a clear nationalist statement. And it's one thing, the use of the alphabet, both North and South, becomes a key sign of Korean nationalism. Now, this is the actual first freshly designed stamp issued by the military government in southern Korea. And the design is rather different in many ways from later stamps. It celebrates the liberation of Korea, which of course took place in August of 1945, but it wasn't until 1st of May 1946 that they actually issued a stamp. This is the first Southern Korean stamp. And this stamp is very interesting because, for one thing, it's in a sense trilingual, because here we have the use of the Korean alphabet, we have the use of Chinese characters, we have the use of the Korean alphabet, and we have the use of Arabic numerals and an abbreviation CN for Jun, for the value of the small currency. Now, the first thing to notice about this are this phrase. This phrase now is read right to left. If you remember the previous one, it's reading left to right, as we would. And this reads, Hei Bang, liberated or free Chosun, liberated Korea, free Korea. Now, why is it reading from right to left? Doesn't make sense in a literal, using a linear arrangement. Here we have the Korean alphabet, O Jun, 5 Jun, and that's then given here, O, That's the Korean pronunciation. It's the Chinese character. And here is the Chinese character for Jun, that hundredth of a one. These are read traditionally top to bottom, right to left. And if you think of how you would write something using a brush, it makes sense that you go down the page and then go up to the top. If, however, you are writing this way, you start here and then you have to work, and then you have to go over here and work this way, and then you go back. If you're writing with a brush, it doesn't make sense. But this is a sort of modernization while still keeping to the traditional right to left way of reading. But here you've got the columns. Here you have the phrase Kinyam, Upyo, commemorative stamp, 5, Jun. Now the image is particularly interesting, and this is actually a rather unusual kind of image. It has the almost Stalinist kind of imagery of figures valiantly holding aloft a flag. It's a kind of style that you don't see a lot of on South Korean stamps. It's almost unusual. But let's look at the detail here. First of all, we have the Korean flag. Now, this was the flag that was used by the former Kingdom of Chosun. It was the symbol of the nationalist movement under the Japanese occupation. And here is this man boldly holding this flag as it flutters behind him. And behind him, we have his wife and his child. Now, both of these are wearing traditional Korean clothing. The man is wearing a Western-style shirt, and he's got his sleeves rolled up here, going to work vigorously. So you have here an image both of modernity and tradition and nationalism. And in a sense, the use of these two forms of the same word, Ojun for 5 Jun, in this form is also a sign of nationalism, but also tradition. So there's a lot of imagery here, but it's a bold statement about Korean liberation. Now this is the first issue for Northern Korea under the Soviet control period. And the images here are quite interesting. First of all, let's look at the statement of what the stamp is. This is Chosun, Upyo, Korean stamp, reading from right to left. And then we have down here the value of the stamp given to 10 Jun, 20 Jun, and here we have 20. This, however, is Ju. It's a Cyrillic letter standing for the term Jun. So here we have something which is trilingual, Korean alphabet, Chinese characters, maybe in quadrilingual, Arabic numerals, and the Cyrillic alphabet. That tells us the difference between the North and the South. The Southern Korean stamps use the Latin alphabet. These here, in this stage, use the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, there's one other thing which is very interesting about these stamps, and the name here. Notice this and this is Chosun Upyo, but this is pronounced Chosun, because you can see this shape and this shape are different. This has two lines here. This is Jo and this is Yo. This is O and this is Yo. It means at this stage that the pronunciation had not actually become standardized. And even in this stamp design, which somebody would have had to think about and approve, they hadn't really quite settled on what the pronunciation of the word should be, the precise pronunciation. And here again, we see the same form using the Chinese characters, the Arabic numerals, and the Cyrillic alphabet. This flower here, known in English usually as the Rose of Sharon, it was the Korean national flower. However, it is now known officially as the South Korean flower. It's not recognized that way in North Korea. But here, at this stage, in the very early period, this was the only national symbol of this type, the only national floral symbol that they could use. It was a shared image. And this image is very interesting. Again, here we have the name of the state, and you notice they're using the same form of pronunciation as this stamp, and distinguished from this. Again, we have the Chinese character value, Arabic numeral, Cyrillic script. The image, the Diamond Mountains, these are in North Korea. They're one of the great renowned beauty spots, not only of the Korean Peninsula, but of East Asia. This image also appears on very early South Korean stamps. It was something simply accepted as being Korean, not necessarily South Korean. So they have chosen on their first stamps to use a recognized Korean floral symbol and a geographical symbol, which is both North Korean, but I think at this stage they're just thinking it's Korean. So those are the very first issues of freshly designed South and North Korean stamps. Now, at the end of the first year of independence, what kinds of stamps were issued? Now, this gets very interesting because these stamps are very different indeed. This is from Southern Korea. And here, this is sort of vaguely bilingual because here you have the use of the Latin alphabet and the Arabic numerals. But otherwise, all of the script is given in the Korean alphabet. And here we have it reading from left to right. Chosun Upyo, Korean stamp, 50 Jun, 50, 510 Jun. And the title is given down here, again, reading from left to right. Haebang Il-ju Nyan Kinyam, a commemoration of the first year of liberation. But notice this character here. We have one line across, two lines down. That's pronounced Ju, but it would be normally now read Chu. There's no Y sound there. So again, this is an indication that they're sort of mixing things up a bit because the pronunciation hasn't actually quite settled down. But the image is the particularly interesting thing here. Here we have a dove with an olive branch in its mouth flying towards the Korean Peninsula here. So liberation, freeing Korea, is bringing peace to the peninsula. And here I think you can vaguely make up the outline of China. Here's the Shandong Peninsula, and this would be Manchuria, and Siberia is up here. But here it's very dramatically flying in to the peninsula. It's bringing peace. So how did, in North Korea, Northern Korea, on the same date, what stamp did they issue? This is particularly interesting for a number of different reasons. First of all, let's look at this composition. Here we have Chosun Upyo, reading here from right to left in a very traditional form. And the style of the lettering has been made to look vaguely like a very traditional form of Chinese characters they call seal characters. It's a style. But notice this, they have put in the middle a symbol, which is the Rose of Sharon. But look how they've used that. That use of a floral image at the top in the middle to be a symbol of the nation comes from Japanese design. Here we have the great leader as a young man looking off into the future and backed up by the great symbol of Korean nationality, what we now call the South Korean flag. But this, of course, at this point was the only Korean flag that any Korean would have known. So here is the leader of Northern Korea with what we now think of as the South Korean flag behind him. The stamp has the South Korean national, what we now think of as the South Korean national flower, but of course this was the only symbol they knew. Interesting, he is also dressed in a suit. This, I believe, is taken from a picture that was shot at the time that he gave his speech to the assembled multitude in Pyongyang when the Soviet Union brought him in just after around the time of the Japanese surrender to celebrate Korean liberation. But again, notice here, we've got the value of the stamp at 5, 10 Jun, 50 Jun, in Chinese characters reading right to left. Then we have the same value, 50 Chen, in the Cyrillic alphabet. Here we have the line telling us what this stamp is, Haebang, liberation. Now remember, in the South Korean stamp, this was in the same word was written in the Korean alphabet, not in the Chinese characters. And this tells us this is the first anniversary year commemoration. So a commemoration of the first year of liberation. And it gives the date here using Chinese characters. So it is you've got this is kind of trilingual. You've got the Korean alphabet, you have Chinese characters, and you have the Cyrillic alphabet. You have the use of two symbols which we now associate exclusively with the South, which were only North, which were the only Korean symbols that anybody would have known at the time. But these are very different images. Here, the implication is that liberation is bringing peace to the peninsula. Here, the stamp is celebrating the fact of the advent of the great leader and liberator who's looking off into the future. So right from the beginning, you can see that the politics and policy of the two zones in Korea are taking a very different track. Not surprising, of course, but these stamps are very eloquent testimony to that fact. And this is why these kinds of stamps are useful to conduct historical research. So 2 years later, in 1948, we have the establishment of the Republic of Korea as a state in itself. And it changes the name of the state from Chosun to Taehan, Taehanmin국, Republic of Korea. And here we have this written out in the Korean alphabet at the top. Here's Taehan rather than Chosun, Mingguk for Republic. Republic of Korea stamp. So that's linear, reading left to right. But here we have in the old form the value given not in Chinese characters, but in Korean alphabet, Sa, 4, 1. And there we have the Arabic numeral, the Latin alphabet. At the bottom, very boldly, the phrase Jungbu Sudipkinum, a commemorative of the establishment of the government, in other words, the state. And this is all symbolized by, again, a dove holding an olive branch. And we have the date for this, 1948, 815, 15th of August. But clearly up here at the top, we have Korea. So this is the first time on a South Korean stamp that this word appears. And this is quite interesting because the word Korea had effectively been banished from certainly use within Korea itself and generally in the world during the occupation occupation of Korea, where the country was called Chosen, the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese characters read Chosun in Korea. And I had an interesting example of this when I was doing some research on the types of ceremonies used in the Protestant churches. There was a ceremony created to substitute for the Confucian ancestral ceremony. And the book with all the Methodist liturgy in it, in the back, it had all the publication data, as you'd expect, given in Japanese, and in the bottom, boldly in English, it said, printed in Korea. That was a nationalist statement. And that's, again, sort of quiet nationalist statement. It lets us know where the country is. And in the background, we have these clouds, which is a motif you can find on many calligraphic scrolls, and also on the great medieval ceramics, the vessels where they showed clouds and cranes flying through the clouds. So you have something which is generally promoting peace with a background which is a very traditional image. And we find the same thing here. Here we find again the Rose of Sharon, a clear national symbol. So on these two stamps celebrating the creation of the Republic of Korea, the establishment of the government, we have a sort of universally recognized emblem of peace and a very nationalist symbol. Again, here we have the value of the stamp given in the Korean alphabet and in Arabic numerals and Latin alphabet. And very clearly here the word Korea and the date given down here, and telling us that this is commemorating the establishment of the government. So the images there are, I think, rather restrained, very gentle. What sort of image do we find at the same time? This is the very first stamp issued by the DPR Korea. This is on the 19th of September, 1948. It's a little before the South Korean example. This is a very different feel to it. At the top here, we have the full name of the country, Chosun Minjujuwi Democratic Inmin People's Konghwaguk Republic, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And here we have the line telling us what the stamp is about, Jungang Jongbu Surip Kinyam, a commemoration of the establishment of the central government, in other words, of the state. And here we have, it says Chosun Upyo, Korean stamp. All of this, of course, is in the Korean alphabet. No Chinese characters now. Arabic numerals with, this is now given in Korean. There's no Latin alphabet, no Cyrillic alphabet. But the image, to my mind, is very Soviet here. You have a kind of circle wreathed around by these sheaves of wheat or grain, with a depiction of the peninsula here. At the top is the communist star with the light shining down on the peninsula, and the date of the establishment of the state, 1948, 9th of September. Notice here that the light is shining on the northern part of the peninsula. Very cleverly, the flag, this is the first time now that you really see this new Korean flag. This is now the flag of North Korea. Sort of divides the peninsula. And the north is benefiting from this, and the south is sort of blank. But what is all the benefits of this? We can make out here factories belching out smoke, indicating productivity, modernity, prosperity. This is perhaps a house, but here again, we see a crane building together some large buildings in the background. So agricultural, industrial, prosperity, the good life is coming, and this is all because of the communist system shining its light on the peninsula. Very different images. Now let's move to something rather dramatic. It again is a good reason for using stamps as a historical resource, a source. These two stamps were both issued within relatively short period of time of each other. And these are just, and these stamps I'm showing you are a selection of a series. There's a series of 4 stamps here. This is the celebration, as it tells us across the top in Arabic numerals and Korean alphabet, of the 5th anniversary of liberation, 815, the 15th of August. And in this scroll is above this monument, the Hebang top, the Tower of Liberation, of Freedom, atop which is a star shining its radiance out over the country. This still exists. It was the gift of the Soviet Union during the very early period of their rule in Northern Korea. And notice here, this is celebrating the 5th anniversary of liberation. And we have 2 flags here, the North Korean flag and the Soviet flag. So these are clearly linked together. We are part of a larger movement. We have a close relationship with a powerful neighbor. I'm not actually quite sure what this is. I believe it again it is sheaves of wheat, but I've been unable to actually define what that is. And there we have the name of the state, Chosun Upyo, the Korean stamp. They're 1 won. What's interesting about this is celebrating the 5th year of liberation, which would be on the 15th of August, 1950. This was issued on the 20th of June, 1950. 5 days later, North Korea invaded the South. So clearly this was meant, this series of stamps was meant to celebrate the unification of Korea. This was designed and issued 2 months before the actual date. Then a few days later, about 2 weeks later, this stamp was issued. It's at the top, it gives us the name of the state, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the slogan here in the scroll says Seoul Haebang Kinyam, commemoration of the liberation of Seoul, 1950, 828. So this is the date June 1928. This is the date in which they invaded and took Seoul. This is the South Korean Capitol building. It was originally the Japanese Government General building, but it was the South Korean Capitol building. And atop this flies the North Korean flag. Again, the name of the state and the value of the stamp. Now, the interesting thing about these is, of course, a stamp takes time to produce. Somebody has to think, we want a stamp to celebrate X, Y, or Z. We then have to design it. Somebody has to approve the design. The materials to produce the stamp, the ink, the paper, the printing presses, and so forth, all have to be put together. So this isn't just something that somebody has scribbled on the back of an envelope. This is a product. And the fact that it was done in advance, in this case, and clearly I suspect this was also done in advance, indicates that the North had intended to invade the South. Now, this is quite well known now and recognized information that came out of the Soviet archives. But this had been a debate before whether whether North Korea had invaded the South or whether it had been forced to do so by South Korean activity. Well, clearly, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. So this is just one sort of historical source you have to have other sources to interpret all these things, but this is one source that can be used. There's nothing at this time from South Korea at all. But the next thing we do have, which is of interest, is at the end of that year, the 20th of November 1950, after the United Nations had agreed to defend South Korea, the North Korean forces were pushed back over the 38th parallel, and in fact, the UN troops, the Gloucester Regiment, in fact, of the British Army, had reached the Yalu River. And it was at that time that it seemed like the North Korean regime had disappeared entirely. And this was just at the time then that the Chinese volunteers poured across the border and pushed the UN forces south and over the 38th parallel. But at this time, there was South Korean, what we now think of as the South Korean government, the Republic of Korea government, celebrated national unification. And there's a phrase here, which we'll see on all three stamps. It says, Gukto Tongil Kinyam Upyo, stamp to commemorate the unification of the national territory. Now, and here we have again the name of the country, Daemingguk, in Hangul, the Korean alphabet, and very clearly in English, and the value of the stamp there. Now, what is interesting about this stamp is, of course, we have an image of the President of the Republic of Korea, Syngman Rhee. Here, this portrait is a cameo enclosed, of course, by the olive branch, but it's surrounded here by a prime Korean symbol, the Rose of Sharon. And we've seen this several times in these different stamps. So here we have another stamp. We have tells us what the stamp is about, the value of the stamp, and the name of Korea is given twice, Daemingguk, Korea. And here we have the Korean flag again, flying, the South Korean flag, as we now call it. And it is flying over a crater lake, which is on the boundary between China and Korea. And this is also a nationalist symbol because it is thought that Tangun, the mythical ancestor of the Korean people and state, was born on this mountain. So this volcanic crater lake called Baekdusan is as much a symbol of Korea and Korean nationalism as this flag. There's something else which has been added to, which is new. And if you look here, it's not so clear, but here it's clear, 4283. And we find that there as well, over here, 4283. What does this mean? That is the Tangi calendar. The Republic of Korea, when it was established, changed the calendar system. That is the year count from the Christian year, which would be, let's say, 1950, to a date based on the purported birth date of Tangun. We just referred to the mythical founder of the Korean state people. So this is 4,283 years. So again, we have three nationalist symbols here, two of which clearly have to do with the myth of Tangun. And the interesting thing about this is that the leadership of the South Korean state at this time was significantly Christian. It had Christian leaders. Syngman Rhee was a Methodist. So it's interesting. But these sorts of images were seen as nationalistic rather than what some people might say pagan or not. Here we have an image of Korea, the Peninsula, and you have two symbols, the United Nations and the Republic of Korea flag. This is saying this is the state that is recognized by the world body. And again, we have a date. We have this symbol of nationalism, the flag, and also the Tangi calendar date there. So shortly after this, the Chinese had pushed the UN and South Korean forces south of the 38th parallel. So, but this is how they presented unification. Right, to conclude, what's the first stamp that was issued after the end of the Korean War? That is, after the armistice agreement on the 27th of July. In South Korea, the Republic of Korea, this is the first stamp. And what does it celebrate? It celebrates, if you read down here in this column, and notice this is in Hangul alphabet, but done in a traditional form of reading in linear form. And this is Taehan, Korean, Jungong, Central, Kidokyo, Christian, Changnan Youth Hui Association. In other words, YMCA, the Korean YMCA. They are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the YMCA. And here you can see the YMCA symbol with the word cham in place of the word truth. And we see the vague outline of the Korean Peninsula behind it. Here, the date is given in the Tangi calendar, 4236 to 4286. So 50 years in the Tangi calendar, and the currency has been changed to Hwan from won. So the first thing they do to commemorate after the end of the Korean War, which is 3 months after, is the founding of the YMCA. North Korea gives a very different take, and this is published a day after the armistice. So there was some planning that went into this. This just didn't appear the next day. And this is rather more difficult to read, but here it says, Yongung-juk, heroic Chosun Inmin-ui, heroic Korean peoples, the Chosun Inmin, Korean peoples. This is a possessive, we. Sunni Manse, congratulations to the victory of the heroic Korean people. In other words, North Korea had won the war. And the leader is given here in a nice cameo, surrounded by the palm branches. A central figure here is a Korean woman in traditional clothing, holding some flowers. And here we see workers and military figures, name of the state, and the value of the stamp. But this is the celebration, the victory of the Korean people and the leader. Here, again, it's a sort of quiet Soviet type of style. So looking at these stamps, we can see that they, right from the beginning, and not surprising, but right from the beginning, there are different ways of conveying North and South the identical kinds of issues. Liberation from Japan, celebration of the first anniversary of liberation, creation of the state, unification of national territory, conclusion of the war. They're very different, and they reflect the political ethos of the states. Not remarkable, because we know that, but it gives evidence to it. And looking at the particular images gives you some detail or nuance to the general issue of nationalism and the attempt to build up support for the government and the system of politics. So, as we say in Korean, good, the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor. People did a lot more than listen. The chat box is we've got some good questions. Thanks.
Oh, well, very good.
Yeah. I think, definitely. Professor and I were talking about people, starting a semiotic study circle. So do let us know in the chat box or Heidi@stamps.org if you are interested in learning or participating in more semiotics. Okay, first question. Were the characters on the Japan stamp overprinted for Korea, Chinese, or Japanese characters?
Oh, the very first one. No, they were the Korean alphabet.
Korean alphabet. So we have that. Okay. The
So
name.
you can take that as a nationalist symbol. It's a clear statement. They're not just overprinting the Korean, the Japanese stamp so that it says Korea. They could have done that using Chinese characters because 60% of Korean vocabulary derives from Chinese characters. And you can write it using Chinese characters, or you can write it phonetically using the Korean phonetic alphabet. They chose to use the phonetic alphabet. And so that right from the beginning, they were using the Korean alphabet. It becomes a prime symbol of Korean nationalism.
To use Korean. To use
the Korean alphabet.
The use of the name Korea. Old European maps give its name as Korea, spelt with a C, not a K. So why wasn't it used in Korea?
Well, that's interesting. And in fact, most of the European, certainly the Latin countries, use a C, Korea, for Korea. The change took place sometime around the 1890s, moving from spelling it with a C to a K. I'm not sure exactly what the reason was for, but by the beginning of the 20th century, that had become quite well established. There were, however, some people who resisted that. An interesting example is the Anglican missionary Bishop of Korea, Bishop Korf, the Bishop of Korea at that time. And he in the middle, about 1916 or so, he was the president of the Korean branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And it says so-and-so, Bishop of Korea with a C, and it says president of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea with a K branch. So it was used interchangeably, but by the end of the 19th century, it had become established with a K. Now, one thing to say about that is that quite often Koreans will say, well, that was imposed by the Japanese so that Korea appeared in alphabetical lists after Japan. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. But it I think reflects the fact that K seemed a more natural letter to write for Germanic languages to write the name of the country with.
We have a question from Kurt Streepy, who's with First Collective.
Oh, yes.
Right? So, what is the prevalence of postally used covers of Korea AMG 55 through 60 and Korea Soviet OCC, I guess occupied, 1 through 5?
I can't give an answer to that offhand.
Okay.
Okay. Is he asking the question? I didn't quite get that. Is it the prevalence of particular issues?
And well, then it follows up, Professor. So he says Scott Catalog lists Korea 80 to 84, issued May 10, 1948, as the start of the Republic. It does provide a note with the Dove issues, Scott 91 through 2, that they commemorate the establishment of Korea's Republican government.
Yeah. Okay. I have not been using Scott Catalog. I've been using this, which is the standard Korean catalog, the Korean postage stamp catalog, KPC. There are definitives and there are commemorative stamps. Well, if we take the commemorative issue, let me just look at this. I'm not sure what the Scott numbers would be, but you could take as the first South Korean stamp, actually the one that was issued on the 30th of May, 1950, which is about the general elections. I have preferred to take Sorry, not, sorry. No, sorry.
That's okay. And while you're looking, Kurt, because Kurt is using the chat box, May 10, 1948 issues were for the election, but I see the
Oh,
date.
that's right. That's right. Sorry, for 1948, 1910, you could take that as the date for the creation of the Republic of Korea. I prefer to take the date when the country was actually promulgated, which was on the 15th of August, 1948. That's the date the Republic of Korea actually uses to establish. And that date, of course, is significant because they officially proclaimed the establishment of the state on the date 3 years after Japan surrendered. And so that's always been a very nationalist statement. And that date was also accepted in the North as an important date, although not the date for the founding of the state. Both states celebrated Japan's surrender and as the day of liberation. But South Korea took the day of liberation as its founding date. But you could take the date from the general election of the 10th of May. But I prefer to use the actual date that the state of South Korea chooses.
One last
That's true. You come up with different kinds of things.
Well, one last question, Professor, before our time runs out. I understand that the first issue of Southern Korea for Liberation had printed by the Imperial Japanese Government Printing Bureau in its sheet margin. It's quite ironic. I suppose the defeated Japanese government would not have complained if the credit did not go to them in sheet margin. I wonder how it was decided to include such an imprint unless it was an oversight.
If it appears, it'll reflect the fact that there was no, there wasn't good printing facilities in South Korea at this time.
Okay, well, and that makes sense. That was a.
The printing of stamps. Let me just look at that. I have to change glasses now. The first actual definitive series published by the Republic of Korea was by the South Korean Government Printing Bureau. The first issues of the stamp under the military government were done, according to this, by the by the U.S. military government. It doesn't say where their actual printing services were. If it were in Japan, remember, Japan would have been under American occupation as well. So I can't answer that clearly, but the authority for the printing of it was from the U.S. military government.
Good job, Professor, getting that answer so quickly.
Well, people have some very good questions, some very good detailed questions.
That's what happens when you gather with philatelists, as you well know. And we've come to this is the other thing that happens. These presentations go like that. And so here we go. The end of a stamp chat. We thank you so much, Professor Grayson of the Sheffield Philatelic Society, for joining us all the way from the UK. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience, both live and on YouTube, for joining us. Stamp Chat was brought to you by Stamp Store. Looking for items to add to your collection? Shop stampstore.org with over 325,000 items and new items being added almost daily. You are bound to find some great treasures. Items are member-owned and carry a 30-day money-back guarantee. We invite you to browse today, stampstore.org. For more Stamp Chats, visit YouTube APS channel on the playlist Stamp Chat. We have over 60 hours, and we've added a couple things, or a couple presentations from the virtual stamp show. please use the comment box to go ahead and keep that the conversation rolling. We do monitor it, and anything that we can't answer, we send off to our guests. So we'll keep in touch with Professor Grayson. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and do sign up for our newsletter at APS on stamps.org, where you'll find out Stamp Chats the very first. You will be the first people to know and get the registration link. Thank you so much. We've got a Stamp Chat with Mr. Gary Lowe tomorrow at 6 p.m. And again, if you have any further questions for the professor, you can go ahead, email me, Heidi@stamps.org. Everyone take care, collect, connect, visit stamps.org. Thank you. Thank you,
all.
Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.